Not all wars begin with swords drawn or cities burned. Some begin quietly, with something as simple as golden as a single apple. I still remember the sky that morning. It was too perfect. Aegean blue, endless and unbroken, so clear it felt like the gods had polished it with their own breath. The marble columns of Hera's temple glowed under the sun, and the sea air whispered through olive trees like a secret waiting to be spoken. I was no one, a servant, a shadow in sacred halls. I poured wine for gods I could never speak to, and swept floors they never walked on. But it was in that silence, in that stillness, when no one was looking, that the war began. The temple buzzed with preparations more alive than I had ever seen it. The wedding of Peleus and Thetis was to be the grandest celebration since the forging of Olympus itself. A mortal and a sea nymph bound in sacred union by the will of Zeus. Every god was invited, every goddess adorned. Golden goblets were polished until they mirrored the stars. Ambrosia flowed like waterfalls from sky-silver urns. Laughter spilled from divine mouths, deep and melodic like thunder in springtime. I moved quietly beneath the sound and shimmer, arranging flower offerings at the feet of Hera's statue. Her stony gaze watched everything proud and cold, as if already sensing what none of us did. And then she appeared, not in the light, not through grand entrance or summoned chariot. She was just suddenly there. Eris, the goddess of discord, she was not invited. No servant called her name. No place was set for her among the couches of the gods. Her shadow stretched longer than her body as she stepped over the threshold of the sacred grounds, barefoot, unadorned and silent. She did not shout. She did not rage. She simply placed it, a small object, delicate gleaming, set upon a polished slab of marble near the temple gate. I was perhaps the only one who saw it done. I was walking past with a platter of pomegranates and spiced honey cakes when my eyes caught the glint. A golden apple. And not just golden like the sun. Golden like a whisper, golden like temptation. Golden like everything the heart secretly wants and fears to touch. It lay there untouched, but not innocent. On its skin, in looping ancient script, were the words, "To the fairest." I felt a strange stillness wrap around me. The kind that comes before a storm. The kind that presses on the chest and says, "Remember this moment. This is where everything changes." The gods, unaware, at first laughed and toasted. Hera in her heavy crown. Athena with her spear resting by her side. Aphrodite. with her hair braided in roses and sunlit strands. But then they saw it, first Hera. Her gaze sharpened like flint. Then Athena, who rose without a word. And Aphrodite, who leaned in closer, a slow smile curling. 3 goddesses. 3 glances, and 1 golden apple. The silence that followed was thick. I held my breath without realizing. Even the birds seemed to stop mid-song. Time paused. Each of them reached for the apple at the same time. Each claimed it. Each said, "I am the fairest." Their voices were calm at first. Reasonable, like noble queens debating a matter of court. But beneath those voices I felt it again, that tightening in the air. That sense of something invisible, ancient, curling like smoke around the pillars. Zeus, seated above them, all raised a hand. Not to decide. No, he refused. "I will not judge this," he said. His voice was low but final, like stone, settling into place. Let the mortal decide. And just like that, the apple was not just fruit. It became fate. A choice passed down the marble steps of Olympus into the world of men. And with it came everything desire, pride, jealousy, war, Paris. That was the name Zeus spoke. A Trojan prince living far from palaces, tending sheep on Mount Ida. Unaware that the gods had just cast their gaze upon him. The goddesses left. In a shimmer of divine light, their smiles sweet, and serpents underneath. Each would visit him, each would offer a gift, power, wisdom, love. And the one he chose would be more than beautiful. She would be the spark that lit 10,000 ships. I stood alone as the laughter resumed. As the gods forgot briefly what had just passed between them. But I could not forget. I saw the apple still resting on the altar stone, now ignored and yet glowing as if with breath. I could feel its weight from across the courtyard. So small, so perfect. So dangerous. And I knew then, though, I did not understand the fullness of it, that I had witnessed the beginning of a war that would outlive gods and men alike. A war not of strategy or lands, but of hearts wounded by pride. A war that would end in fire. And begin with gold. Some say gods are beyond jealousy, but I saw differently. After Eris vanished like smoke whisked by the sea wind, she left behind only the golden apple and silence. Yet it was not an ordinary silence. It was one that pressed against the walls of Olympus like a held breath waiting to shatter. The apple lay untouched on the white marble slab, glowing faintly with its own light. Though small, it seemed to pulse with power. The inscription, "To the fairest," still shimmered in curling script as though freshly carved by fate's own hand. At first, none dared move. Not even Hera, whose name alone silenced armies. She stared at the apple, not blinking, her lips slightly parted. Then Athena stepped forward, her sandals tapping softly like flintstones. Aphrodite watched them both, her smile delicate, dangerous. I was behind a pillar then, holding a tray of figs meant for Hermes. I should have turned away. I should have gone back to the kitchens. But my legs would not move. Some instinct told me that what I was witnessing would echo for centuries. "I am the rightful one," Hera said at last. Her voice was calm, but every word struck like a drumbeat. "I am queen of the gods, mother of Olympus. The apple is mine." Athena tilted her head, cool and clever. "You are queen, yes, but I am wisdom and war. The apple belongs to the mind and the sword." Aphrodite laughed, soft as falling petals. "And what is the mind without beauty? What is power without desire? The apple was written for me." They spoke slowly, with the measured grace of immortals. But beneath their words, I felt it a storm waiting. Not of wind and thunder, but of wounded pride. Their voices rose, their glances sharpened. The other gods quieted. Even Dionysus set down his cup. No one interrupted. No one dared. Then Zeus. He sat at the head of the hall, wreathed in mist and sunlight, his hand resting on the arm of a throne carved from skystone. His eyes did not blink. His face did not change. When he finally raised his voice, it was low and unmoved. "This matter," he said, "I will not judge." A ripple passed through the hall like a sudden cold breeze. "You will not?" Hera asked, her brows knitting. "No," said Zeus, his voice now harder. "Let it be settled by one not bound to Olympus. Let a mortal decide." The gods murmured. A mortal, it was unheard of. But Zeus had spoken. Who, Athena asked skeptically. Skeptical. Paris, Zeus replied. Son of Priam, Prince of Troy. I had never heard the name, but the way it left Zeus's lips you would have thought he named a prophet. The three goddesses exchanged glances. No more words were needed. In a shimmer of divine grace they vanished. I was left standing behind the pillar, the tray of figs trembling in my hands. The next day, the halls were empty. The laughter was gone. The apple remained. I watched it from afar as sunlight moved across its surface. No one dared touch it. No one spoke of it aloud. Yet its presence changed everything. Whispers drifted like smoke through the corridors. The name Paris floated from servant to priest to oracle. They said he was once a prince cast away at birth due to a dark prophecy, that he now lived among sheep and stars, unaware of the fire his name had lit. In my dreams that week I saw them Hera in purple clouds, Athena with armor glowing like starlight, Aphrodite stepping barefoot over rivers of rose petals, all walking toward a mortal who did not yet know he was being chosen. I imagined their promises. Hera offering empires, Athena granting glory, Aphrodite whispering love. And I wondered, if I had been given the apple, what would I have chosen? I am only a servant. I sweep the halls. I sleep in shadows. No goddess would ever kneel before me. And yet, I couldn't stop thinking of that moment, of how fate sometimes turns on the choices of the quiet ones, of how power begins not with war cries, but with whispers. Some days later, I heard a traveller from Phrygia speak of visions on Mount Ida, of a young man dreaming of 3 women dressed in stars. He had seen them not in flesh but in signs, clouds that moved against the wind, fruit that ripened overnight, a dove that sang in 3 tones. The goddesses had begun their descent. Somewhere on a quiet hill, Paris was about to be asked a question that even gods feared to answer. What is worth more power, wisdom, or love? I never met him, but I imagined him often. A boy born into prophecy, exiled by fear. A shepherd watching clouds roll over ancient stones. A quiet mind unaware that the world's balance now rested in his hands. I wondered, did he laugh when they arrived? Did he tremble? Did he even understand who they were? No one knows how long it took him to decide. A moment, a day, a week. But when the choice was made, it was Aphrodite who smiled. In that smile, a war would bloom. Back in the temple, I passed the empty space where the apple had once glowed. It was gone now. The altar was clean, but something in the air had changed forever. The servants walked quieter, the torches burned shorter. Even the doves that nested in the rafters seemed to coo with unease. That night, I sat outside under the olive tree and looked up at the sky. No stars fell, no signs flared, but I knew the choice had been made, and nothing, not even Olympus, would ever be the same. There are some names that echo long before their owners understand why. I heard his name first in a whisper. Just Paris, nothing more. At the time, it meant little to me. A foreign syllable adrift in temple halls thick with incense and rumour. But even then it clung to the air like the smell of approaching rain. They said he was born in Troy, son of Priam, the king wrapped in royal cloth, an omen, that at his birth the prophets gathered their brows, furrowed eyes distant. One saw fire, another saw ships, a third saw bones scattered like seeds. All agreed the child would be the downfall of the city, so the order was given. As cruel as it was common, he was to be taken from his mother's arms and left on the slopes of Mount Ida, exposed, unnamed, forgotten. But fate does not forget those it marks. They say a herdsman found him crying in the grass beneath a fig tree. Tiny fists curled as if holding the strings of his destiny. The man brought him home, and Paris grew up among goats and sky. He did not know he was a prince. He only knew the wind, the stars, and the names of every hill. He was kind, they said. A boy with a gentle voice and curious eyes. He spoke to birds. He played the flute. He never fought with the other herdsmen. Some called him soft. But even softness has a strength of its own. He was beautiful too, dangerously so. Not in the way of warriors, but in the way of stories. His face seemed carved not by time, but by song. It was said that even the sun lingered longer on him when he slept, but beauty, like prophecy, is a thing the gods watch closely. The day they came to him, he was alone. Morning had just broken. The mist still clung to the grasses and the mountains stretched like sleeping lions. Paris was tending to his flock, humming a tune older than Troy. Then the air shifted. 3 women appeared where none had been before. No footfall, no sound. One in shimmering purple, one in armour that caught the sun, and one barefoot with roses in her hair. He did not know their names, not yet. Hera, Athena, Aphrodite. They told him who they were. Told him of the apple. Told him he would decide which of them was most worthy. He laughed at first, politely, nervously. Surely this was a dream, a test. a trick of the wind, but the apple was there glowing in the tall grass, the inscription the same as before, to the fairest, and so they offered. Hera promised him dominion kingship over the known world. Castles would rise at his word, cities would bow. His name would be spoken in every tongue. Athena promised him glory, victory in battle, unmatched skill in strategy, the immortality of song. He would be wise, feared, and remembered long after the stones of Troy crumbled. And Aphrodite, she promised him love, not love in general, not love as a vague blessing. She promised him her Helena of Sparta, the most beautiful woman ever born, queen of a great city whose smile could turn blades to honey and hearts to fire. She would be his. I often wondered what went through his mind. Was it lust that pulled him? Or was it the ache of knowing he had never belonged to anything grand? And now a goddess offered him a face that would change the world. Perhaps it was simpler than all that. Perhaps he was lonely, and she promised him he would never be alone again. Whatever it was, he gave the apple to Aphrodite. Just like that, fate shifted. The thread twisted. The loom of the gods began to hum. The goddesses vanished. The mountain grew quiet. Paris returned to his flock, the apple gone from the grass, but something heavier pressing into his chest. Far away the winds changed. Ships were unmoored. Names were written into the stone of history. And Helena dreamed, though she did not yet know it, of a stranger's hands. Back in the temple, the whispers turned to murmurs. Priests spoke in half sentences. Oracles stared longer into their bowls. The name Paris now came with warnings and meanings. I began to wonder if I would ever see him. Not the boy, but the man the gods had chosen. Would he look like the stories? Would he be kind? Would he even know what he had done? The servants said he would come to Sparta soon, that he would meet Helena, that it was already written, and still no lightning struck, no mountain split. But sometimes things change in silence. Sometimes the loudest moment is when nothing happens, when a man simply hands a fruit to a goddess and believes the world remains unchanged, but it never does. One evening I lit the temple lamps as the sun dipped low over the hills. The columns caught the orange light and the marble floor looked like spilled honey. I stood for a while just breathing in the stillness, and I thought of Paris, of a prince who had never known his title, of a boy who grew up talking to sheep, now caught in the web of divine ambition. I wondered if he would regret his choice. I wondered if anyone ever truly chooses anything, or if we are all like threads pulled by unseen fingers across the fabric of time. And above me, the torchlight flickered, casting long shadows on the altar. The air was quiet, but heavy, as if the temple itself knew that somewhere far from here love had been promised, and war was already on its way. Fate has many voices. Sometimes it whispers in dreams. Other times it rides in on the sails of a foreign prince. Word came to the temple slowly, as it always did, carried by merchants, travelers, poets. Paris, Prince of Troy, they said, has come to Sparta. I heard it first from a basket seller outside the temple gates. He spoke it like a piece of gossip, not knowing what hung behind those words. Paris had crossed the sea. He arrived not as a conqueror, not yet, but as a guest royal, charming, golden-eyed. Menelaus, king of Sparta, welcomed him into the palace as one king welcomes another. Hospitality is sacred in our lands, more sacred than gold, more sacred perhaps than peace. I imagined Paris stepping onto Spartan shores for the first time, the wind lifting his cloak, his eyes seeking hers. Helena, queen of Sparta, the one promised by Aphrodite, the one who would burn 1,000 ships with the curve of her cheek. They say she was the most beautiful woman ever born. But beauty is not always loud. Sometimes it sits quietly in the corner of a room and rearranges the air. Sometimes it simply is undeniable, inescapable. And when she saw him, something shifted. They called it love. But I have always wondered, was it truly love? Or was it something Aphrodite placed between them? A shimmering illusion, a silk thread around the neck, gentle until it tightens. Menelaus was soon called away to Crete for matters of state. He left his guest in Helena's care, trusting, unsuspecting. A gesture of honor. And so they were left alone. No one knows what words were spoken in those moonlit halls. What glances were exchanged behind embroidered curtains. But when Menelaus returned, his queen was gone. And so was the prince. The news arrived on a storm. I remember the moment I was sweeping the temple's outer steps. The sea wind had picked up, tossing the olive branches like dancers in warning. A merchant ran up the hill shouting before he reached the gates. She's gone. Helena's gone. Whispers turned to gasps. Gasps turned to oaths. The gods were silent, but the city roared. In Sparta, Menelaus tore his garments in the courtyard. In Mycenae, his brother Agamemnon struck the war gong. Across the Aegean kings were summoned oaths, remembered sails prepared. The war had not yet begun, but its shadow stretched over the world like a vulture's wings. In the temple that night, I lit the candles with a trembling hand. The statue of Hera towered over me, her stony eyes unreadable. She had lost the apple. Now she would have her vengeance. They say she and Athena stood beside Menelaus as he gathered his allies' silent divine cold with fury. The gods do not always throw thunder. Sometimes they sharpen mortal hands instead. Odysseus of Ithaca, Nestor of Pylos, Diomedes of Argos, Ajax the Great, and Achilles. Achilles, even before war had truly begun, his name echoed. A boy not quite yet a man, born of Thetis, raised among warriors. It was said he could not be killed except in one small place, left heel untouched by divine fire. Some called it myth, others called it prophecy, but all agreed he would be the blade that cut deepest into Troy. Back in Troy, Paris returned not as a guest, but as a thief bearing a queen. Helena stood beside him at the gates, her golden hair bound beneath a veil, her face unreadable. The people did not know how to greet her. Some cheered, others turned away. A few wept, remembering the legends of what her beauty would bring. Priam, old and weary, welcomed her, because fathers forgive what kings cannot. But the seeds were already sown, and deep in the soil the roots of war began to twist. I, a temple servant, far from palaces and banners, watched the signs as I always did. The lamps flickered for no reason. Doves refused to nest in the rafters. The olive trees gave no fruit. Even the children played in silence. There was no announcement, no thunderclap. But every heart felt it. A storm was coming, and the gods were no longer neutral. One evening, I stood at the cliffs outside the temple, watching the horizon. The sky was pink and gold. The sea breathed slowly, unaware, or perhaps uncaring of the warships soon to cross it. I closed my eyes and thought of the apple. How small it had been. How light it must have felt in the hand. And yet, it had cracked the world open. In the weeks that followed, ships were built. Messages carved into clay tablets. Old spears pulled from walls. Sons kissed their mothers. Wives lit lanterns and whispered prayers. And in Troy, Helena sang at night, in the palace gardens. The guard said her voice was soft, almost mournful, like the sea calling to distant shores. They say Paris stood beside her, his hand gently resting against hers. And for a time perhaps they were happy. But even love, real or not, cannot hold back an army. And even beauty cannot silence vengeance once it's spoken. So now the world waits. Menelaus sharpens his sword. Achilles dreams of glory. Agamemnon counts his ships. And the gods, they lean forward, watching as mortals prepare to do what even Olympus would not. As for me, I still light the temple candles each dusk. I still sweep the floors where Hera once walked. But now when the wind shifts or the flame flickers, I do not blame chance. I know what stirs the air. The promise was made. The weight has fallen. And war at last has begun to breathe. There are moments in history that do not shout. They slip by like wind through curtains. But later, when kingdoms fall and cities burn, we trace everything back to them. One of those moments was a kiss, or perhaps not even a kiss, perhaps only a glance. The story is simple when told aloud. Paris, Prince of Troy, left Sparta with Helena, Queen of Sparta. She followed him willingly, they say. Or perhaps she was stolen. No one agrees. But they were gone, and the bed of Menelaus lay empty. What came next was not simple at all. Back in Sparta, the king's rage shook the pillars of the palace. I heard later that he smashed his own mirror in disbelief, that he walked barefoot into the sea calling her name until the sun went down. But betrayal is not just a wound. It is a flame. It spreads. It consumes, and so it did. Menelaus crossed the narrow seas to Mycenae where his brother waited. Agamemnon, king of kings, hard-eyed, sharp-tongued, a man who did not mourn but moved. It was he who remembered the oath. Years before, when Helena was first offered in marriage, all the great kings of Greece had gathered. She was not just beautiful, she was power. Every man wanted her. Every city feared what war might follow if she were taken. So Odysseus, clever as ever, had proposed a pact. All suitors must swear to protect the man she chose, to guard the marriage even after it was made, to avenge any insult to that union. They all agreed. And now that oath would be called upon. I saw the signs long before the first warship touched the water. In the temple courtyard, the olive trees stopped blooming. The goats gave no milk. The air tasted like iron. Priests muttered about omens. The oracles refused to speak at all. They only stared at the coals, silent as stones. It was then I understood the gods had set the stage, but the mortals would light the fire. Across the Aegean, messengers were sent swift and silent. To Ithaca, to Pylos, to Argos, to Thessaly. Each one carried the same message. The oath is broken. Troy has taken what was sacred. Come, we go to war. Some hesitated. Odysseus among them. They say he had a wife, a newborn son, and no hunger for glory. To avoid the call, he feigned madness, ploughing his fields with salt speaking in riddles. But Agamemnon sent a messenger who placed his infant son in the furrow. Odysseus stopped the plough. He could not let the child be harmed. And so he went. A reluctant warrior, but bound like all the others. Then came Achilles. He had been hidden by his mother Thetis, the sea nymph, who feared what fate held. She dressed him as a girl, sent him to a distant court, hoping the war would forget him. But war does not forget its champions. Odysseus found him by trick, by riddle, by fate. And Achilles, realizing he could not outrun destiny, agreed to fight. But before he left, his mother whispered in his ear, "If you go to Troy, your name will live forever." But you will not. He went anyway. I imagined the gathering often, kings from every shore, ships lining the beaches like teeth of the sea, armor polished, spears sharpened, horses snorting in the morning fog. Thousands of men called not for justice but for pride and for the promise of one woman, Helena. They say she stood on the walls of Troy and watched the horizon, that she wore white silk and no crown, that her hands trembled at her sides though her face remained still. What did she feel, remorse, resolve? Or was she too bound by a fate spun long before she was born? Paris stood beside her. His hand rested on the stone. His eyes squinted into the light. Neither of them spoke. Behind them, the people of Troy began to murmur, some in awe, some in warning, some in fear, but still no sails yet appeared. The silence before war is not peace. It is breath held too long. It is the stillness of a storm just out of sight. Back in the temple, we cleaned the statues twice a day now. Hera's image had begun to darken, not from dust, but from something deeper. The air around her felt heavier, less forgiving. She had been slighted. Her apple was gone. And now she would not rest until balance was restored. That night, I stood on the roof tiles looking at the stars. I thought of the oath, of the kings, of the queen who fled and the prince who dared to take her. I thought of how one apple, one promise, one moment of weakness could ripple across continents. Some say war is born of ambition. Others say greed. But I say this, sometimes war is born because too many hearts are wounded at once, and no one knows how to bleed quietly. In the distance a raven cried. The wind shifted. The lamps in the temple flickered one by one. I closed my eyes, and in that darkness I saw sails, hundreds of them, like white teeth marching across the sea. They say the gods made the sea restless that year. The tides forgot their rhythm. The waves whispered names in foam. And across the coastlines of Greece sails began to bloom. I had never seen a war begin, not truly, but I heard it. It began in hammer strikes echoing from shipyards, in the calloused hands of carpenters sanding holes smooth as skin, in boys learning to hold spears instead of flutes, in mothers who sang lullabies more quietly, as if afraid the wind might carry their sons' names too far. The oath that once had been a clever trick, just words on the wind, now came alive like wildfire through dry grass. Odysseus, despite all his cleverness, left Ithaca. Nestor, old and wise, once again donned his armor. Ajax, huge as a mountain, stood ready without hesitation. And Achilles, young and golden, joined them with a look in his eye that was not quite fury, but not quite peace either. It was not one army that rose, it was many. Each city brought their pride, each king brought his grievance, and all of them brought ships. I watched from the cliffs above the temple as the harbours filled. Black hulls, white sails, shields glinting like fish scales. They called it the greatest fleet the world had ever seen. They say there were 1,000 ships. I do not know if that number is true. But I know this, when I looked out to sea, the water no longer looked like water. It looked like a forest of masts. It looked like war made physical. And still the wind blew east. The priests of Hera moved more quickly now. They burned more incense. They whispered longer. They said little, but I saw the tremor in their fingers when they touched the altar stone. Hera had waited. Now she would strike. She whispered into the dreams of kings. She walked unseen between tents. She turned memory into anger and loyalty into steel. This was no longer about love. This was about a promise broken, a crown insulted, a queen displaced, and no goddess, especially not Hera, would leave such an insult unanswered. On the shores of Aulis the fleet gathered, but the wind did not blow. The sails hung limp. The sea was still. The men waited for days, then weeks, and then they demanded answers. The priests cast bones. The oracles wept. And at last the truth was spoken. Artemis was angry. Agamemnon, proud and blind, had killed a sacred deer in her woods. Now the goddess demanded sacrifice. His daughter, Iphigenia, a name I had never heard before. But I could not forget it once I had. They tricked her, they say, told her she was to be wed to Achilles. She came dressed in white flowers in her hair. The soldiers stood still as stone. And Agamemnon, he wept, they say. But his hand did not tremble when he gave the order. The knife fell. The winds returned. That night, I lay in the courtyard of the temple staring up at the stars. I thought of Iphigenia, of how one life had been demanded to launch 1,000, of how sacrifice once spoken could never be unspoken again, and I wondered, would the gods remember her name, or would she too be forgotten like the deer, like the apple, like the quiet promises made before war begins? At dawn the fleet launched, 1,000 sails, 1,000 prayers, 1,000 sons who would not all return. The sky turned gold with smoke. The sea churned with purpose, and across the world the people of Troy looked up to find the horizon dark with vengeance. From the high walls of the temple I watched until the ships vanished. I did not cheer. I did not pray. I only listened to the silence they left behind. It was not empty. It was charged. Like the pause before thunder. Like the last breath before a scream. And in that stillness I finally understood the war had not begun when the first arrow was loosed. It had begun when the gods placed desire above peace. When mortals took up their oaths like torches in a dry field. When one girl was led to an altar and no one stopped it. Now the sea would carry the weight, and every wave would remember her name. Iphigenia, the sea does not keep secrets. It speaks them, in waves, in foam, in wreckage washed ashore. I remember the day the fleet left Aulis. I watched it from the high terrace of Hera's temple, where the wind never sleeps. What had once been a rumor had become real ships beyond counting, cutting through the wine-dark sea. Oaths once whispered were now oars beating the water. The war was not just coming, it had begun to move. But the sea is not a path. It is a trial. The gods do not bless a journey with ease. And as the fleet sailed east toward Troy, the winds turned spiteful and the sky turned blind. The storm came 3 days out from Delos. Thunder fell like drums from the heavens. Lightning walked the sky like furious gods searching for names. Waves rose as tall as cliffs. And ships proud and strong just hours before splintered like broken promises. Some men screamed. Others prayed. A few simply stared at the storm and said nothing. Among them, Achilles stood at the prow of his ship, unflinching. He did not hide. He did not bow. He let the rain soak his cloak, let the wind tear at his braids. He was not afraid. He was waiting for the sea to test him. And it did. Many ships were lost. Some say 20. Some say more. No one knows the real number. The sea does not count. It only takes. Those who survived washed up on strange shores, scattered wet and shaking. But not defeated. No. That was the gift of the storm. It did not end them. It hardened them. By the time they reached Troy, they were no longer suitors avenging a queen. They were soldiers bound not by loyalty, but by the long suffering of survival. Back at the temple, the sky was quieter, but the air was not. Wind moved strangely that week. It bent olive branches without sound. It turned the incense smoke sideways. It whispered names I did not recognize. One morning, as I swept the steps, I heard it clearly. Patroclus, Menelaus, Ajax, and in the very next breath, death. I paused, broom in hand, heart hammering. No one else heard it. Only the wind speaking softly in syllables heavy with fate. The gods had begun to choose, not who would live, but who would matter. They had stepped back, yes, but not away. They still watched, still whispered, still weighted the dice. Some men would rise like sunlit marble. Others would fall like silent ash. But all of them had been named. In Troy they say the watchers saw the sails before the soldiers. From the top of the great towers, the children of Priam called out in alarm. And Helena, they say she stood on the balcony of her chamber, her veil in her hands, her eyes fixed on the line of ships stretching to the horizon. No tears, no words, only the wind tugging at her gown as if trying to pull her back. Beside her stood Paris. His face was pale, but his chin was lifted. He did not touch her. He only looked out at the sea and said, "So they came." In the palace below, Priam gathered his sons. Hector noble and calm. Deiphobus, fierce-eyed. Troilus, still barely more than a boy. The gates were sealed, the weapons polished. The war no longer rumor was at their walls, but Troy was not afraid. Its walls were high, its archers many, its gods still present, at least they believed so. And as for me, I listened. Each day brought new names on the wind. Names I did not know. Names I would soon never forget. Odysseus, great of mind, shadowed of heart. Nestor, voice of history, voice of sorrow. Diomedes, brave and silent. Achilles, always Achilles. his name louder than the rest, as if the wind itself could not contain it. That night I lit the last of the temple lamps and climbed the southern stair. There beneath the open sky I whispered each name I had heard, not as prayers, not as warnings, only as a witness. Achilles, Hector, Helena, Paris, Agamemnon, Iphigenia. The flame trembled with every word. And when I was finished, I sat in silence. I do not know how long I stayed there, but I remember the breeze and the feeling that every name I had spoken was now somewhere across the sea being written in blood. It did not come with a trumpet. It came with footsteps, with the sound of leather sandals against dust, with the creak of wooden wheels carrying towers toward gates of stone. The war had arrived. Troy, for all its legends, had never seen it before, not like this. Not with spears sharp enough to carve gods from sky. Not with men shouting oaths as if each syllable could shatter walls. The Greeks had landed. They did not attack at once. Instead they built walls of shields, lines of tents, rows of cook fires stretching along the coast like a second city facing Troy. At night, their songs rose over the waves fierce and drunken. In the day they marched and measured, trained and prayed. It was not a battle. It was a siege, and Troy waited. From the towers I saw them. First 12 ships, then 100, then more than I could count, each bearing a banner, each filled with men who believed their names would outlast the war. The first blood came not at the gates, but in a clearing near the river Scamander. A raiding party, a skirmish. 2 champions met beneath a sky too bright, too quiet. Menelaus' brother betrayed stepped forward, his sword flashing in sunlight. And Paris golden, beautiful, unready. They faced one another not as armies but as men. And the gods leaned in to watch. The fight was short. Paris faltered. Would have died had not Aphrodite unseen intervened. They say she wrapped him in mist, pulled him back to Helena's chamber, laid his sword beside him as if he had won. But everyone knew, even the Trojans, it was not victory, it was escape. And Menelaus, he smiled bitterly and said nothing. But his silence was heavier than any spear. From then on, the duels changed, not between Paris and Menelaus, but between champions. Hector stepped forward, the heart of Troy. Where Paris was flame, Hector was stone, solid, still, unshakable. He did not speak of glory. He spoke of duty. When he rode into battle, the walls themselves seemed to breathe. The Greeks answered with Achilles. He did not come with trumpet fanfare. He came with silence. But once in the fight he moved like fire made flesh. His spear found men before their armor did. His voice, when raised, made even seasoned warriors pause. And beside him always stood Patroclus. Quieter, gentler, but with eyes that watched everything. They fought not for kings, not even for honor. They fought for each other. And the battlefield listened. I stood often on the ramparts bringing herbs to the priests or messages from the temple. But mostly I watched. I watched men clash like waves. I watched the dust rise and never settle. I watched the ground drink the names of the fallen. And I began to understand something I had never been taught in the sacred texts. The earth remembers. It remembers footsteps. It remembers blood. It remembers the weight of each dying breath pressed into its soil. Troy did not fall. Not that year, not the next, but it changed. The laughter became rarer. The children played quieter. Even Helena's songs in the garden grew slower, like petals falling in windless air. Some said she smiled, some said she wept at night. But the truth was that even she no longer knew which part of her was love and which part was ruin. One morning, while sweeping the upper halls of the temple, I found an old bronze helm behind a column. It was small, perhaps a boy's, perhaps a servant's. Its cheek guards were bent, its crest was gone, and inside was dried blood. I sat with it for a long time, not because it frightened me, but because it felt like a whisper from the future. A future I was walking toward with every step. A future where names would vanish but grief would remain. That night thunder echoed beyond the plain. Not a storm, but war drums. Both sides had begun to name the dead, to burn their bodies with cedar and chant their deeds to the stars. It was not for mourning, it was for memory, because in war to be forgotten is the only true death. I lit the altar flame as I always did, but now I whispered their names into the fire. Menelaus, Paris, Achilles, Hector, Patroclus, Ajax, Odysseus, and so many more. Each name a spark, each spark a thread in the tapestry of this great terrible thing we had become part of. And as the flame flickered, I thought, what would the earth remember when this was done? The blood, the names, the apple, or would it remember the silence between battles, the prayer whispered before a sword was drawn, the girl who sang in the garden, not as a queen, but as a woman trying to forget? The ground does not speak, but it remembers. And I remember too. There is a sound I came to recognize, not the clash of swords, not the shouting of names, not even the cries of the dying. It was the sound of armor in motion, dozens of bronze plates brushing together like wind chimes made for war. That sound was a warning, not of death, but of nearness, because when that sound came close, it meant the battle had returned to the walls. Troy did not fight in the fields alone. Its heart beat behind the stone. Each morning, soldiers passed through the great Scaean gate with spears raised high. Each night fewer returned. The ground before the walls grew uneven with the dead. We no longer named them. We no longer mourned them. We swept them, buried them, piled stones so the dogs would not come. The soil had forgotten how to breathe. One evening, I was sent to bring herbs to the healers. The temple had begun to supply more than prayers. Ointments, water, cloth, and silence. The wounded lay in long rows beneath canopies. Some called for mothers, some called for gods, but most simply stared at the sky as if searching for something they had left there. I passed one boy no older than I had been when first taken into service. His leg was gone. His eyes were open. He whispered something I could not understand. Then he smiled and died. Not loudly, not dramatically. He simply stopped being. And still the battle raged on. The Greeks had built siege towers now, wooden giants with jaws like dragons. They rolled them toward the walls as if daring the gods to strike them down. Sometimes the fire from Troy found them. Sometimes it did not. One tower reached the western gate. Its ramp fell with a groan. Men stormed across. For a moment, just a moment, the enemy stood on Trojan stone. And then Hector came. He did not shout. He did not wave a banner. He simply walked onto the wall and met them, like a shepherd facing wolves. They say he killed 5 men in 10 heartbeats. I believe it, because when Hector fights, the stone beneath his feet seems to remember its own strength. The tower was set aflame, the dead thrown down, the breach sealed again, and the people of Troy, they wept with joy. But I saw the weariness in Hector's eyes, not fear, not anger, only the deep bone-heavy weight of a man asked to carry too much for too long. That night the moon rose red, and in the courtyard of the temple the doves did not sing. Hera's statue stood colder than usual. The flame at her altar flickered once, then turned blue. I did not sleep. Instead, I sat by the steps, listening to the wind again, and it spoke, not names this time, but a word I had not yet heard, shadow. It sent a shiver into my spine, because in a war of kings and champions, shadow meant something else, the things that move without armor, the dangers unseen. By morning, the Greeks had changed their tactics. Now they came at night, not with horns, but with ladders, whispers, daggers and rope. The shadows beneath our walls became thick with death. Archers were posted. Torches burned without rest. But the darkness could not be held back forever. One morning, a guard was found slit from navel to throat. Another missing entirely, only his helmet left on the parapet. Some said it was Odysseus creeping through the dark like smoke. Others said it was Apollo's punishment for too many prayers unanswered. I said nothing, but I began sleeping nearer to Hera's flame. Even the gods might notice a boy if he stayed close enough to their fire. The war no longer moved in days. It moved in names. One died, another rose. This one fell. That one avenged, like a tide that gave no rest. And in the heart of it all, two names rang louder than the rest, Achilles and Hector. They did not meet. Not yet, but the battlefield bent around them like trees bowing in opposite winds. It was only a matter of time. I passed Helena once in the palace garden. She did not see me. She was singing, not to anyone, not for joy, but as if trying to remember a melody that no longer belonged to her. A servant brushed her hair. A girl braided it with gold. But Helena, she did not move. Her hands rested in her lap, her eyes on nothing. Some called her a curse, others a prize. But I saw something else, a shadow wearing the shape of beauty. She had not chosen war, but she had not stopped it either. And now the walls remembered her with every crack and arrow. That night the wind howled. It had a new name, death. It did not say who. But the war had begun to ask for someone greater, a balance, a turning point. And I knew a moment was coming where the story would split and only one name would remain. There are moments in history where everything shifts, not because of armies, not because of gods, but because one man forgets for a breath that pride is heavier than fate. The Greeks awoke to find their greatest warrior gone. Achilles had vanished from the field, not dead, not wounded, withdrawn. Some whispered he had gone mad. Others said he had been betrayed. But the truth was simpler. Agamemnon, king of kings, crowned in fire and arrogance, had taken what was not his. The girl, Briseis, a gift, a prize, a person. Achilles' heart was not in her beauty, but in the insult. He had been disrespected, and that more than spears or arrows wounded him. So he left the war. Without Achilles, the Greeks faltered. Their lines thinned, their shields cracked, and the Trojans, smelling weakness, surged forward. Hector led them like the tide. Wave after wave struck the Greek camp. And this time, the sea did not push them back. The war turned. The walls of Troy did not crumble. The Greeks did. I heard it in the rhythm of footsteps. Before they marched. Now they scattered. I saw it in the wounded that arrived at the temple. Before they boasted. Now they begged. I felt it in the air. Before it burned with ambition. Now it sank with dread. And I knew balance had broken. One evening, the sky turned the color of rust. And the sea looked like a basin of old blood. From the cliffs, I saw the Greeks burning their dead. The smoke climbed like unanswered prayers. There were no songs, only the crack of bones. The gods were watching, yes, but none of them moved. Not Hera, not Athena, not even Zeus. Perhaps they were waiting to see how men would balance themselves again. In the Greek camp, Nestor whispered strategy. Odysseus crafted lies sharper than blades. Menelaus prayed, but nothing worked. Hector drove them back to the edge of their ships. And then came the moment pride was paid in blood. Patroclus, kind-eyed, quick-smiled, steady-handed. He went to Achilles, knelt and begged. "Let me wear your armor," he said. "They will think I am you, and their fear will save us." Achilles' silence said nothing for a long time. Then he nodded, but his eyes were not calm. They were storms held back by shorelines, and so Patroclus went, not as himself, but as legend. He wore Achilles' helmet, his breastplate, his wrath. The Greeks rallied behind him. For a moment, a single brilliant moment, the war turned back. Trojans fled. Men shouted. Hope lit like fire. And then Hector met him. The duel was not meant to happen. But war does not listen. Steel met steel. And in that clash, Hector did not see Patroclus. He saw Achilles. He saw the fire that had burned so many. And so he struck. And Patroclus fell. The sand took his blood. The wind carried his name. And across the camp, in a tent, quiet with absence, Achilles heard it, and everything broke. He did not scream. He did not curse the gods. He sat still for a long time, Then he stood, and the war changed forever. He returned, his armor now dull with dust, his hair wild eyes red. He walked not like a hero, but like a storm given legs. When the Trojans saw him, they did not cheer. They tightened their grip. They prayed beneath their breath, because they knew this was no longer war. This was vengeance. Achilles did not wait. He did not sleep. He found Hector before sunset, and the world stopped. Even the birds, even the gods. 2 men, 2 names, 2 futures. One would rise, one would fall. The duel was long, not in time, but in weight. Each strike was a sentence, each dodge a memory, each breath a goodbye. And in the end, Hector fell. Achilles did not smile. He did not speak. He took the body, tied it to his chariot, and dragged it across the dust. Pride was not yet finished. Honor had been broken, and with it so had balance. That night no one slept. Not in Troy, not in the Greek camp, not even in the temple. Even the stars seemed afraid to shine too brightly. And I sat by the altar listening, not for names, not for whispers, but for silence. The kind that comes after something sacred has been broken. And I wondered, was this what the apple had meant to cause? Was this what the gods had truly wanted? Not victory, not justice, but imbalance, grief, and memory. Memory that cannot be undone. In the end, pride had its price. And the earth, once again, remembered. People think war is fire, loud, short, glorious, but most of it is waiting. Not the kind of waiting that passes, the kind that clings, that stretches days into years and years into stories that no one wants to tell. After Hector died, everything stopped. Not completely. The war did not end, but it stumbled, like a beast struck in the leg, still dangerous but slower, meaner, more tired. Achilles did not sing. He did not boast. He did not even fight. He sat by the sea day after day, staring at the horizon as if it owed him something. Some said he mourned Patroclus. Some said he waited for death. I think he had become it. And so the years passed. Yes, years. Troy did not fall. The Greeks did not leave. Instead, they built deeper trenches, stronger fences, heavier silences. The ships stayed docked, their sails folded like sleeping wings. The men aged slowly, some from wounds, some from time. Fathers became ghosts. Boys became soldiers. Heroes became names that only fire remembered. Even the gods seemed to step away. The omens faded. The visions stilled. The wind once filled with names grew quiet, but the war remained. A great dull weight sitting on all of us, not crushing but pressing. Like the feeling of knowing something is wrong and knowing it will never be fixed. Inside the city, Troy changed. The markets were quieter. The temple floors colder. The prayers shorter. We no longer asked for victory. We asked for endurance. Let my son live another week. Let my husband keep his hand. Let me remember my brother's face. And sometimes we asked for forgetting, because remembering was worse. Helena no longer sang. She walked the gardens less. When she passed through the halls, her veil always covered her face. Not from pride, but from weariness. I saw her once place her hand on a broken statue and whisper something in a language I did not know. Maybe it was her own name. Maybe it was someone else's. Maybe it was the truth. On the plains, the battles still happened. Small ones, skirmishes. No glory, no song. Just dust and blood and the same tired cries. Ajax still fought. Odysseus still planned. Agamemnon still ruled. But none of them smiled. They had forgotten why they were there. Only that they could not leave. One winter, the sea froze along the shore. Fishers broke through ice to bring food. Men huddled in ships like rats. Even gods do not make war in that kind of cold. And yet the war waited. So we waited too. I grew taller. My hands roughened. I learned the weight of silence better than any scripture. Some nights I lit the temple lamps and said nothing at all. Not out of doubt, but because silence had become the only honest prayer One morning, I found a bird dead on the steps of Hera's altar. A sparrow wing stiff. I buried it beneath the olive tree, and for the first time in months, I cried. Not because it had died, but because something so small had still managed to fall. Even in a war of giants, the smallest things break. I heard rumors in the city that the Greeks had begun raiding islands, that Achilles had taken new captives, that Odysseus no longer believed in kings, that a wooden horse had appeared in someone's dream. And I thought, when war grows too long, men start dreaming of strange things, not because they are mad, but because reality no longer feeds them. The wind returned one spring, soft at first, then louder, and with it came a new name, Neoptolemus. I did not know it. But the flame on the altar flared when I whispered it, and that was enough. The bloodline had not ended. Achilles would leave something behind, but even that hope felt like a shadow. Years into the war, we forgot the beginning, not the story, the feeling. We forgot what it meant to be stunned, to be betrayed, to be angry. Now we were only tired, and that was worse, because even fury can be survived. But weariness, it becomes you. Sometimes I wonder, did the gods lose interest? Or did they plan it all this way? Not for the war to destroy us, but to wear us down, to hollow us, to see how long we could stand before we sank under the weight of our own memories. Troy did not fall, but it lowered. Its light dimmed, its voices dulled, and outside its gates the Greeks waited, and waited, and waited, as if time itself had become the enemy, and none of us would ever win. It did not begin with war drums. It began with emptiness. One morning, I awoke to silence a kind I'd never heard before. No horns from the beach, no chants from the Greek camp, no fires, no ships, just wind and the sound of birds returning to the fields. The Greeks were gone, or so it seemed. From the walls, the people of Troy leaned forward not in joy, but in disbelief. The shoreline where tents once stood was bare. The sea was open, and in the center of the plain stood a shape. A wooden beast, tall as the gates, silent, staring. A horse. Some thought it a gift, some a trap. Some said it was an offering to the gods. The priests circled it. The soldiers touched it. The children threw stones at its legs, but it did not move. And in the silence it became louder than any siege tower. I stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the sunlight slide along the wood. It was beautiful in a way that frightened me. Too still, too perfect. I had seen the Greeks build war machines, but nothing like this. No seams, no ladders, no ropes, just a body carved from silence. Look, the priest shouted. Burn it, he said. Leave it where it stands. His voice cracked through the hush, but no one listened. Not when the Greeks had gone. Not when Helen stepped forward and said, "It is a sign. The war is over." And when she said it, everyone wanted to believe. Even I wanted to believe. So we opened the gates. They pulled the horse into the city. Slowly, proudly, trumpets played. Flowers were thrown. I watched it pass beneath the arch. Its shadow fell across my face, and something inside me went still, like a bird folding its wings in the middle of flight. That night, the city lit fires for the first time in years. Real fires. Not funeral pyres, not watchtowers. Celebration. Wine flowed like rivers. Music returned to the streets. Mothers laughed. Children danced. Even the stars seemed to flicker brighter. And above them all, high above, stood the horse, silent, watching. I went to the temple, not to pray, just to listen. And there, in the deepest shadow of the altar, I heard it. Not a voice, not a cry, a whisper. Tonight, that was all. Just one word, but it was enough. By the time I returned to the street, the fires had begun. Not the ones we lit, but the ones we didn't. From behind closed doors, from rooftops, from within the horse. The Greeks had never left. They had hidden inside, waiting, listening. And now they opened the gates and let the rest in. Troy did not fall in battle. It fell in sleep. In the quiet moment after relief, but before the dream breaks. That is where we were broken. I ran, through smoke, through screams, through temples on fire. The palace burned, the gardens wilted, the statues cracked, and all around me, shadows moved. Not soldiers, ghosts, shaped like men, but walking with vengeance. I saw Helena, standing at a balcony, flames behind her, her hair alight. She did not move, she did not scream. Perhaps she understood. Perhaps she had always known this would come. A price delayed is still a price. I reached the temple. Inside, the sacred flame was still burning. The wind howled outside. Swords clashed in the streets. But here in this room of stone and gods, all was still. I knelt, and I said the names, not just of the living, not just of the dead, but of the forgotten, the lost. The ones who never had songs, because if I didn't, who would? By morning the smoke had cleared. The sun rose over rubble. The gates hung open. The towers cracked. And the horse still stood. No longer a gift, not even a warning. Just a memory carved in wood, of trust, of pride, of endings. They say Troy was doomed by the gods, that its fate was written in stars. But I believe it was lost not in the fire, but in the whisper before it. In the moment we chose to forget fear and call it peace. Now I walk the ruins. Ash clings to my sandals. The wind calls no names, but I still light the flame, and I still remember, because the gods forget, and the kings fall. But memory, if kept, endures, even after the horse, even after the fire, even after the end. The fire had stopped, but its echo did not. It lingered in the air, in the cracked stones, in the faces of those who woke and found the world gone. Troy was not destroyed in one night. It was undone slowly, like a name whispered until forgotten. I walked through the ruins barefoot, not out of reverence, but because my sandals had burned. The temple lay open to the sky. The walls were blackened, the statue of Hera split down the middle like a vow unkept. But the altar still stood. And so did I. The streets were no longer streets. They were paths through rubble, through memory, through smoke. I saw a girl digging beneath a fallen door. She did not cry. She did not call for help. She simply kept digging, as if what she searched for might still be warm. Menelaus found Helena, so they say. No one knows what he said. No one knows if she knelt or fled or wept. Some say he forgave her. Others that he killed her and took a ghost home. But I saw her once that morning alone in the garden that no longer bloomed. She was touching a charred branch, her face unreadable. And for a moment I believed she was already gone. The Greeks did not stay long. They took their gold. They took their spoils. They took their silence. And they left. Some ships vanished into storms. Some never made it home. Some brought their cursed victory to cities that would later fall, because nothing taken by fire is ever truly owned. Odysseus walked among the ruins before he boarded. He did not look triumphant. He looked tired. He passed me once, paused, and said, "Tell it right." Then he was gone, as if he knew stories outlive even kings. I stayed. There was nowhere else to go. And someone had to remember. I lit the altar each dawn, even when it rained. Even when it snowed ash, even when no one was left to watch, I spoke the names of the fallen, of the forgotten, of those who had no one left to speak them, because to name a thing is to refuse its disappearance. Years passed, but the city did not grow back. It sank into the soil like an old god into myth. The wind carried fewer voices. The stones stopped echoing, but the bones remained, and so did I. Sometimes children from distant villages come. They climb the hill, ask if the stories are true. Was there really a golden apple? Was there really a horse? Did gods really walk among men? And I say, yes and no. The apple was not gold. It was envy made beautiful. The horse was not wood. It was a silence too tempting to resist. And the gods, they were there, but only because we invited them. Not in form, but in pride. In vengeance, in every choice made louder than love. I do not know how long I have lived. Perhaps the gods forgot to take me. Perhaps I belong to the city as much as its dust. But I still wake, still tend the fire, because something must remain. A flame, a story, a witness. even if only for the wind. And so when you ask me, what ended Troy, I will not say the Greeks, nor the gods, nor even the war. I will say, the moment we stopped listening to the quiet, to the doubt, to the small voice that says, do not open the gate. And in that forgetting, we let in the end, not with swords, but with welcome. And the price for that is forever. They thought it was over, that once Troy had fallen, the world would begin again, that the ships would carry them not just home but back to before. But war never ends at the gate. It follows, like smoke in the folds of a cloak, like salt in the skin, like the sound of fire behind closed eyes. The Greeks sailed away, their ships heavy with gold, with broken statues, with women who did not speak, cut across the sea like blades. And the sea watched, silent, then stirred. I did not see them go, but I saw the sky. It darkened the moment they vanished beyond the horizon. Not like a storm, like a warning. The gods had not finished with them. Because when you burn a sacred city, the ash clings. I heard stories brought by travelers, sailors, men who limped into markets with stories too heavy to carry alone. Agamemnon returned to a kingdom that no longer waited. His wife Clytemnestra did not greet him with wreaths, but with a blade. She killed him in the bath, they said. Blood in the water. Silence in the halls. Ajax never made it home. Poseidon, some say, split the sea beneath him. Others whisper he went mad and threw himself into the waves. All I know is that the ocean swallowed him whole and returned nothing. Menelaus brought Helena back, and Sparta rejoiced. But when they looked at her, they did not see a queen. They saw a war, 10 years long, 1,000 ships deep, lit by a single face. She walked among them like a ghost, smiling when they bowed, but never blinking, never blinking. Odysseus, his story was different, longer, stranger. The gods kept him, they say, tossed him across islands like a leaf caught in divine breath. He wandered for 10 years, saw monsters, witches, sorrow carved into cliffs. But I think they delayed him because home was no longer where he belonged. The war had made him a story, and stories do not return to silence. Back in Troy, I sat beside the altar listening, for thunder, for names, for the wind across the sea. And what I heard was grief, not fresh, not loud, bold, dry, like bones beneath sand. A girl came once from Mycenae. She had dark eyes and quiet steps. She knelt before the altar, touched the scorched floor and said, "My father died on the ship." Then she left, not another word, because that was all she needed to carry. And more than anyone should, I began to mark the years not by seasons but by returns. Each time a soldier came back and found no home, the war returned. Each time a wife wept beside an empty hearth, the war returned. Each time a child asked why the sun set in silence, the war returned. It never left. It just wore different faces. I heard of cities that fell after Troy, not from armies, but from rot. Greed bloomed like flowers. Lies grew into crowns. And kings forgot that fire does not make thrones stronger, only shorter. I kept lighting the flame, because someone must. Because if there is no one to carry memory, then the curse finds silence and grows louder inside it. They called it a victory. But I wonder if the gods looked down that night and laughed, not in joy, but in pity, because the men who burned Troy had only burned the walls, not the war. Now when the sea is quiet, I sit by the shore, and I imagine them. Menelaus older, Odysseus lost, Helena never sleeping, and I ask the wind, was it worth it? And the wind does not answer, only brings me the scent of ash from across the sea, still warm. They do not remember the war, not really. They remember the silence afterward, the way stones still held warmth long after the fire, the way adults pause before speaking names, as if each word might crack open a memory. These are the children of ash, of ruin, of whispered stories told too late or not at all. They came slowly one by one, orphans, wanderers, sons and daughters of men who had no graves. Some were born in the years after the gates fell. Others were carried as infants through shattered streets. They grew among ruins between vines creeping over marble. They learned to run barefoot across broken floors, to laugh without knowing what had once stood where they played. To them, Troy was not a city that fell, but a place that always looked like this, cracked, quiet, still breathing in its sleep. I did not ask them to come, but they came, and I taught them what I could, how to light a flame that stayed, how to speak the old names without trembling, how to listen to the wind, for it still carried fragments of prayers. They did not always believe, but they were kind, and that sometimes is better than faith. One girl, Thessa, used to sit beneath the statue of Apollo, the one with only half a face left. She would hum songs she said came to her in dreams. No one taught her the words. They were not in our language, but the wind stilled when she sang. I never asked her what they meant. Some music is not meant to be translated. One boy, Helen, found a helmet in the dust, bronze green with time. He wore it everywhere, not as a soldier, as a question. Whose was this, he asked. No one remembers, I said. Then I will, he answered. And from that day he called himself by a different name. Not his father's, not his own, but the name inside the helmet, a name even I had forgotten. They asked me stories, but not the ones about kings or gods. They asked about the moments in between. What did the stars look like the night the gates fell? Did anyone try to stop it? Was there ever a time you believed it could end without fire? And sometimes I didn't answer, not because I didn't know, but because silence is also a kind of truth. They carved their own paths through the rubble, planted gardens in old courtyards, hung fabrics between broken pillars, painted walls with colors I did not know. They did not rebuild Troy. They reinvented it, from fragments, from echo, from whatever the war had not taken. And in doing so, they became something new. Not Greeks, not Trojans, but something born from the space between. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Thessa sat beside me on the temple steps. Do you think the gods regret it? She asked. The war, I said. No, she said. Us, I thought for a long time. Then said, I don't think gods regret. That is what makes them gods. She nodded, then whispered, then it's good we aren't them. Sometimes I wonder, was this what the gods wanted all along? Not the fire, not the fall, but the silence after. The chance to listen to the ones who had no voice before. The children, the nameless, the ones who saw what remained and did not look away. At night, they lit lamps through the city, not in mourning, but as markers, to show that someone still lived here, that even in ruins light could return, soft, small, steady, like memory. And now when travelers come and ask me, is this where Troy once stood? I smile, because Troy is not beneath their feet. It walks, it sings, it wears bronze helmets and paints on broken stone. It hums in the half voice of children who were never meant to survive, but did. And in them the war did not end. It was transformed, from curse to echo, from ash to root, and what grows from it now is ours to tend. There was once a time I thought the flame would never go out, that as long as I tended it, fed it ash and oil and prayer, it would remain. But nothing in this world stays lit forever. Even fire grows tired. The altar still stands, but the stone is colder now. And when I strike flint, the spark hesitates. It takes longer to catch. The wick burns shorter, as if the gods themselves are drawing back, not in anger, but in forgetfulness. The children have grown. Most have gone. Helen took the road west, following the river, where Troy's trade once flowed. Thessa went east, chasing music in dreams, her songs now too wide for these ruins. Some remained for a time. They tended gardens, they lit lamps, but one by one they left, as they must. Even memory cannot be a cage. I do not blame them. This place is not for the living anymore. It is for silence, for echoes, for those of us who cannot leave because we were never meant to begin again. We are not survivors. We are remnants. The wind has changed. It used to smell of olive wood and distant rain. Now it carries nothing, just space. The kind of space that comes after the last voice in a hall has gone still. Yesterday the flame went out, just for a moment, but long enough that I felt the cold inside my chest. Long enough that the shadows felt closer than memory. I relit it, of course, with old hands, with breath held like prayer, but something in me knew. Next time it might not return. I do not fear death. I fear forgetting. I fear that the names I carry will vanish when I do, that the stories will rot beneath the soil unspoken, undreamed. What is a war no one remembers? What is a fall no one sings of? Just dust. And I have breathed enough of that. I went to the sea this morning. The tide was low, the waves barely moving. There were no ships, just driftwood. Shells. A broken bronze bracer buried in sand. I picked it up. It was warm. Not from the sun, but from something deeper. Old fire. Old grief. Still there. Still glowing. Even after all this time. When I returned, I lit the flame again. And I whispered, not the great names Achilles, Hector, Helen, but the others. The ones with no statues. The ones who died screaming, not singing. I whispered them until my voice cracked. Then I whispered them more. Because that is what the flame is for. Not glory, not myth. Remembrance. That night I dreamt of the horse again, but not as it was. It stood now in a field of flowers, covered in vines, its mouth open to the sky. Children played in its shadow, not knowing what it once carried. And in the dream I wept, not from sorrow but relief, because maybe in forgetting the war we remember life. I don't know how many days remain, but each morning I still strike the flint. I still watch the wick catch, and I still say the names, one by one. Softly, steadily, until the flame forgets how to burn. And when that day comes, when the last spark fades, I will not cry. I will only whisper, you were remembered, and let the darkness mean something. There is a hill beyond Troy, not marked on any map, not named in song, just a rise of earth shaped more by memory than stone. That is where I go now, not to watch, not to guard, but to become. The climb is not far, but my knees argue, my lungs too. The body does not forget the weight of years. Only the mind tricks itself into thinking it can still carry flame. But this hill carries me. Each step feels lighter. Not because I'm strong, but because the burden begins to set itself down. At the top, there is no monument, only soil, and grass, and wind. But in the silence I hear them. Not loudly, no chorus, just a presence. Like the warmth that lingers long after someone has left the room. Once I feared forgetting. Now I see. Forgetting is not an end. It is a transformation. Ash does not vanish. It settles. It feeds the roots. It becomes earth. And in time, the earth remembers in ways that tongues cannot. I kneel, not in worship, not in defeat, in peace. I press my hand to the soil. And I whisper the names again. But now they do not echo. They absorb, like water into dry ground. No longer shouted, no longer carried on wind, but planted. The sky shifts as I sit. Clouds pass slowly. Birds circle in wide arcs above, uncaring of what happened here centuries ago. And I find comfort in that. Because for too long everything here belonged to gods and ghosts. Now at last it belongs to the earth. There is a tree here now. I did not plant it, but it grew from cracked rock, from forgotten ash. It bends slightly, as if listening to something beneath. Its leaves shimmer like old bronze in the wind. I touch its bark. It feels alive, not as a memory, but as a promise. They ask sometimes those who still visit, what is this place? And I answer, it is where names become roots. They smile, not understanding. And that is fine. It is not a place for understanding. It is a place for returning, even if one does not know what was lost. I no longer tend the altar. I no longer light the flame, because the hill does not need fire. It needs only time, and quiet, and the weight of footsteps that do not break the ground. Once I believed I was the last witness. Now I believe I was just the bridge, between war and wind, between memory and silence. Between the gods who demanded and the earth that receives. The sun begins to lower, not in drama, not in fire, softly, As if it too is tired of being watched, I close my eyes. I do not need to see it set. I have seen enough endings. This one feels complete. And when I open my eyes again, the stars will be there. Not heroes, not signs, just stars. And beneath them a hill. And beneath that roots. And beneath that names. And beneath them all the peace that comes when ash becomes earth. Some dreams are not made of sleep. They rise in silence. In music without words. In questions left behind by the dead. Troy still breathes not in stone but in story. And some still dream of her, even now. A boy once came to the hill, not born of war, not born of ruin. He was a traveller, a listener, barely 16 with dust on his sandals and eyes wide with want. He said nothing when he arrived, just stood where the wind met the grass and looked as if waiting for something to rise from the ground. After a while he asked, "Is this where the great city stood?" And I said, "No, this is where it rests." He nodded and said nothing more, but stayed. Each night he lit his own fire, not at the altar, but on the edge of the hill. Small, careful, contained. He stared into it for hours, as if searching for answers in the flame, or perhaps for faces. One evening I asked, "Why have you come?" He said, "My grandfather fought in the war," or so the songs say. He never returned. But the stories did. I asked him, "What do you hope to find here?" He smiled, "A piece of what was lost, or at least a shadow of it." That night I dreamt of the city again, not in fire, but whole, its towers lit by morning sun, its streets alive with footsteps, the scent of bread, the call of markets. No war, no gods, just life. And I wept when I woke. Not from sorrow, but gratitude, because dreams too can carry truth, even if they lie. The boy stayed for 7 days. On the 8th, he placed a small stone beside the tree, carved with only 2 words. He remembered. Then he left, not like a pilgrim, but like someone who had placed something down and could now walk lighter. Others came too, not soldiers, not kings, just wanderers. Mothers with children on their backs, dancers seeking silence, singers chasing the shape of forgotten melodies. Each of them carried a dream of Troy, not the city, but what it meant, what it could still mean. Some asked to stay. I let them. We made tea from dry herbs, told stories under stars, laughed more than I expected, because even in grief there is lightness, and even ruins can echo joy. They asked me, "Do you think Troy will return?" And I said, "No, but something else will grow where it once stood. Not the same, not as grand, but rooted in memory." They call that hope. I call it patience. One girl brought seeds. She planted them around the tree, olive and pomegranate, she said, for shade and sweetness. She did not know the wars those trees had witnessed, but still she gave them back to the soil. And I think the land remembered her name long after she forgot it. It is strange how a place can be both end and beginning, how a dream can outlive even the gods who once demanded it, how the wind carrying only dust and silence can still sound like prayer. I do not speak often now. My voice grows thin. But when I do, I speak softly, as if the grass is listening, as if the hill has ears, because it does, because Troy is not gone. It has simply moved inward, beneath skin, beneath story, into dream. And when I close my eyes at last, I know someone else will sit here and listen and remember, not because they were told, but because they dreamed it. And some dreams are more real than memory. For years the wind lingered here, as if waiting for something, a word, a flame, a name. But now it moves freely, not in mourning, not in rage, just as wind does. I feel it in my bones. The time has come, not for ending, but for release. Troy has shed her final shape. She is no longer ruin, no longer glory. She is memory without burden, and that is enough. This morning I walked the hill once more. Each stone where I left it, each name where it was planted, the tree taller now, its roots deep. Its leaves whispering songs no lips recall, a bird nested in the branches. A simple thing, but it felt like the god's final word. Not thunder, not fire, life. I sat beside it as I have many times. But this time, I did not speak. I had nothing more to say. The story was told. The silence knew the rest. A wind came from the east. Not strong, not cold, just present. And for the first time it did not pause. It did not look back. It moved through me and went on. And I knew then. The wind no longer waits. It does not linger for the dead. It does not search for the past. It carries what it must and lets go the rest. Troy is no longer a place. She is a movement. A breath between generations. I have seen her in fire. I have seen her in ash. I have seen her reborn in roots, in dreams, in silence. And now I let her go. There is no ceremony, no last rite. Only the hill, only the sky, only the whisper of leaves. I lie down beneath the tree. The earth is soft. The sun is warm. The wind moves on. And for the first time in a lifetime, I follow. And somewhere someone hums a song they do not know. Somewhere a child draws a horse without knowing why. Somewhere a fire is lit, not to remember, but to warm the living. And the story, as it always has, changes its name. Not Troy, not Ilium, but something quieter. Something grown from all that fell. It walks without sandals. It speaks in no tongue. It waits nowhere, because now the wind no longer waits, and neither do we. There was once a city that burned, and a flame that tried to hold it, and a voice that tried to name it, and when all else fell away, the dream remained. You ask me now, did it happen? Was there a golden apple? A goddess scorned, a war of 1,000 ships, a horse and a trick and a fall, and I smile, because that was never the question. The real question is, why do we still listen? The wind no longer waits, yes. But dreams do. They wait in ashes, in silence, in children's questions, in songs sung without words. They wait in the breath you hold just before sleep takes you. And there Troy lives again, not as fire, not as marble, not even as memory, but as something softer, a rhythm, a weight, a hum in the bones, a pulse in the dark that says something mattered. It is not about Helen, not Achilles, not Hector. It is about the pause in your chest when the flame goes out, and you whisper, I remember, even if you don't know what, even if no one told you the tale, even if it never happened, still you remember. And that is the point. The story is not here to be believed. It is here to be carried, like a pebble in your pocket, like a name without a face, like a song you hum but never learned. It goes with you, quiet, small, steady. I am gone now. But I was never truly here, just a voice, one of many, and another will come. And another. The names may change, the gods may fall, but the dream is patient. So close your eyes. Let the ship sail back into fog. Let the horse vanish into the fields. Let the ash settle beneath the tree. And if one night you hear the wind stir and the earth breathe, do not be afraid. It is only Troy turning in her sleep, still dreaming, still waiting, still yours.